Hello again. It's been a while since we've been together in our Bible study of Isaiah, but today we're going to play a little bit of catch up. I've got my cup of coffee and I've got my Bible, and we're going to do some discussion and catch us up to chapters 54. Now, we left off at chapter 39, so we've got a ways to go. But let's start with just a little bit of review of 36 to 39, which is the historical transition in the book of Isaiah. This is where Hezekiah was being under siege. Now, Hezekiah was the king of Israel, and Israel was under siege by Sennacherib and the Assyrians. Now, a siege usually would take about 2 years. What this would mean is that the enemy would encamp outside the walls of the city, and they would remain there. They would have plenty of supplies, but then they would prevent supplies from going into the walled city or anyone coming out. And so they would basically starve them out, because then when somebody tried to come out to get food, that's when they would invade. Well, as the Syrians are encamped outside of the walls, Hezekiah looks at them, and this is a fearful, fearful thing, because the Assyrians were such a dangerous. They were also a very cruel people. So he knew that when they came in, it would be torturous and would be very difficult. Now, Hezekiah had done what the Lord had asked him to do, and he had been faithful and done what was right in the eyes of the Lord. And so when he looks out up here, he knows he does not have the army to defeat them. He knows he does not have the equipment to defeat the Assyrians. And he is in the last walled city of Israel, because the Assyrians have already taken the northern kingdom in 722 BC. We are now just after that period. They are ready to completely destroy Israel. Rabshakeh, who is the speaker in this scenario, that is probably a title rather than a name, and he was representing the king Sennacherib. He comes and starts using psychological warfare of shouting put-downs to Hezekiah and to Israel, and saying that the wall was so crumbly that even a fox walking on it would cause it to crumble. And then as he continued this, Hezekiah asked him not to speak in the language that the people understood, but to speak in Arabic, because the leaders did understand it. He said, no, your people need to know that they're soon going to be so bad that they're going to be having to eat their own waste. And so he's attempting to scare the people. Now, when he does this, Hezekiah tells the people, shh, don't answer him. Don't say anything. Well, the people followed Hezekiah and his request, and they didn't respond. And so Hezekiah takes this letter that Rabshakeh had written to him, and he knew that if the Assyrians took him over, that it was going to be a torturous and an awful invasion. But he takes this letter and he lays it out to the temple and lays it out before the Lord and tells him, here's what they're saying to me. And he says, I'm bringing this before you and asking you to take care of them, not but for our sake, but for your sake, because they have discredited the God of Israel, the one and only true God. And so that night, the death angel goes through the Assyrian camp and kills all of the army, every single one of the 185,000 member army. The king then goes back, rather frightful, goes into the temple of Dagon, who is his god, and when he does, his sons come into the temple and kill him. Now, for all practical purposes, the Assyrian army is gone. The next thing we see is Hezekiah's illness. There is some question about the timing. Did his illness come before the Assyrians or after the Assyrians? It is written linear that he came afterwards, and it's both dates have some validity. But we see this in the next chapter, and what Isaiah comes and tells Hezekiah that he is ill and he's going to die. And Hezekiah cries out to God. He turns his face to the wall and begins to pray to God. And he does this by relating the things that he's done for God before. Well, Isaiah comes back and tells him, the Lord has granted you another 15 years because of your humility and your service. Isaiah tells Hezekiah that the sun will go back. Now, this means that the sun reversed itself. So this was the sign that God gave Hezekiah to show him that he was going to answer his prayer and live another 15 days. Now, that's some pretty miraculous prayer. You pray one prayer over an army, and the next day you get up and the whole army is gone, but all of their supplies are there. So they brought all the supplies in and had plenty for their people. And then another prayer is that he has a terminal disease and he's given a reprise, and the sun goes backward to prove to him. So we got not only that transition showing us God's provision, they were being judged by the Assyrians, but they came in humility to God and trusted him. They see this miraculous answer to the prayer. And then when Hezekiah comes to him with a humble heart, he again sees an answer and a miraculous sign to prove the answer is from God. Now, there's another nation up and coming about this time, Babylon, and its leader's name is Nebuchadnezzar. Now, he hears about Hezekiah's illness, and he basically sends him a get well card. But then when Hezekiah is recovered, Nebuchadnezzar comes and visits, and Hezekiah tells him all about his illness and how he was cured from it. And then he takes him into the temple, and he shows him how they've rebuilt it and restored it, and then he takes him into the nation's storehouse. And in there he sees all of the wealth of Israel, which at that time was extremely wealthy. And so he's very happy to show it to him. And after Nebuchadnezzar leaves, Isaiah comes and sees what he's done, and he says, how much did you show him? And he said, all of it. And Isaiah scolds him for this and said, tells him that there will be another siege and that Babylon will become their enemy. Now, Hezekiah responds and says, oh, well, good. Now, we're not real sure whether he meant good, I'm not going to be alive to see it, or good, this will be a good thing for Israel. We're not sure. But we do know that this time with Hezekiah then takes us into the next section of the book of Isaiah, which starts with chapter 40, and it starts out with, comfort ye, comfort my people. Now, where we have had judgment, and then we have had the war, then we have God's intervention. We have a picture there of how God took care of his own. They were being rebellious. They were turning to idolatry. And in our last session, we talked about the demonic forces that lead people. Worshiping an idol is the spirit of a demon. And so we talked a little bit how to study about demons. But this was the time that God was showing them they had nothing to fear from man or from demons, because he is the one that's in control. He is the one that is watching out for his own people. And he does this by saying, comfort my people. He's not taking away the trial. He's going to bring them through it. The trial is there because of their rebellion. because of their disobedience. They would worship at the gods of these other nations, and then they would go to the temple on the Sabbath and make a sacrifice. It was an affront to God to keep doing this, and he has to cleanse them of their idolatrous hearts. So had they done this on their own, they probably wouldn't have had to go to Babylon. But because they didn't, he told them in Jeremiah, if you want to serve these gods, you're going to live under these gods. And he said, you go to Babylon with them, you don't fight, you go there, you build houses, you plant gardens, you give your daughters in marriage, and you make homes there. Well, they didn't want to do that. They kind of fought against that. Well, as a result, the king at that time, Zedekiah, was captured, and his sons were killed, and his eyes were put out. And then they were all taken prisoners into Babylon in 586. So in 722, the Assyrians took over. In 586, the Babylonians took the last of Jerusalem and completely destroyed it and destroyed the temple. They took him into Babylon for 70 years, and the land of Israel is empty. Now God told he told Jeremiah. Jeremiah asked him, how long will they be in captivity? And he said, for 70 years, until the land has its Sabbaths. Now what he's saying there is that the law read that for 6 days they could work the land and get the producing, or 6 years, get the produce off of it to sell and to eat, to provide. But on the 7th year, they were to let the land lay fallow, or to let it just lay silent and not do anything to it. And then on the next year, on the 6th year, they would collect 3 years' worth of produce. 1 year for the 6th year, 1 year for the 7th year, and then 1 year for the next year when they are having to regrow their crops. So God had provided for them, but he told them that this was to let the land have its rest. They didn't do it. They kept working on Sunday, even though their Sabbath was on a Friday night to a Saturday night. But that's what it was. They kept working. If you go down any main street in our country today on a Sunday morning, you will find commerce is being completed just like it was a Monday or a Tuesday. It is no different anymore. That's what they were doing. Now we get into 40 and we see that the first thing that God tells them is that he's going to have, that there is going to be comfort that's going to come to them. He talks in verse 3, a voice is calling, clear the way for the Lord in the wilderness, make smooth in the desert a highway for our God. Well, this is the introduction or the prophecy of John the Baptist, who came proclaiming that the Messiah had come. And then he says, then the glory of the Lord will be revealed, and all flesh will see it together, for the mouth of the Lord has spoken. So this was in 700 prophesying about Christ coming as the Messiah. Then we see, he tells them, it goes on a little further. The thing that makes Isaiah difficult to understand is the mixture of time periods, all in one chapter. Another thing that makes Isaiah difficult to understand is the Hebrew poetry that it is written in. And Hebrew poetry is written with parallelism. That means it will make a statement in a poetic form, and then the next line will be a different statement in poetic form, but it is a definition of that first one or a complement to that first one. And so you think there's two statements there when they're basically the same. And sometimes that happens with ideas. Well, when we get to verse 9, well, in verse 8, let's look at the last sentence. He says, The word of our God stands forever. Now, the first word in that sentence is but. Now, that's a contrast word. That means you're going to have a different idea from the idea that was in front of that. So when it's in front of that, it says, in verse 6, a voice says, what shall I call out? All flesh is grass, and all its loveliness is like the flower of the field. The grass withers, the flower fades, when the breath of the Lord blows upon it. Surely the people are grass. The grass withers, the flower fades. You see the repetition here. And what he's talking about is the shortness of life. That man's lifespan is very short. It's like grass. It sprouts up and then it withers. And he says, but the contrast is the life of man compared to the Word of God. How long does the Word of God last? Forever. And he says in verse 9, get yourself up on a high mountain, O Zion, bearer of good news. Lift up your voice mightily, O Jerusalem, bearer of good news. Lift it up. Do not fear. Say to the cities of Judah, here is your God. Now he is prophesying about the Babylonians coming and taking over the land. But in this particular chapter, he is talking about after the Babylonian captivity. Now, at this point, the people have dodged a bullet with the Assyrians, and life is returning somewhat to normal. They can come and go. They can have commerce. They can worship in the temple, and they still have their idols. But they are not under siege. Life is a little bit precarious, but it's still going on in a normal pace. So God is coming to Isaiah, and he is telling them he's going to comfort his people, and he's going to comfort his people with the promise of the Messiah. Now, this is looking towards the time of Jesus. And then when he tells them, Zion, when he calls out, oh Zion, bearer of good news, this is a kingdom word. It is talking about later, the end times, a future that we have not even seen yet. O Zion, the bearer of good news. The good news is that of our eternal home in the kingdom of God. Now, Jerusalem is the one that this message was given to by God. The reason Israel was not formed as a nation, it was born as God's inheritance. And we know Ezekiel 16 is a good poetic passage that tells how Israel came about. Nations were built by people or by conquering, and they would build their sovereignty as a nation, but not Israel. Israel was when God called Abraham out of Babylon, or Ur of the Chaldeans, and he called him in and said, you go to a place I'll show you. And in this place, when he got him there, he made a covenant with Abraham in Genesis 12. And that covenant was for land, which is Israel, and people, which is the Jews. And he told Abraham that they would be more than the stars in the sky, the sands of the sea, and that the land would go as far as he could see. Now, obviously, the land is not all that God promised it to be, because it was supposed to go from the Nile to the Euphrates. And that has not happened yet. So this is one of the keys to finding your timeline, is what is it prophesying, and is that happened yet? Well, as we move on, we see that it's going to say the Lord will come with might. I'm in verse 10. With his arm ruling for him. Behold, his reward is with him, and his recompense before him. Like a shepherd, he will tend his flock. In his arm, he will gather the lambs. and carry them in his bosom. He will gently lead the nursing ewes. Now, the shepherd was a very common sight that was part of they were sheep herders. So they understood this poetic language about the sheep. And sheep are really dumb animals. They have to have a shepherd, not only to protect them from wild animals, but also from some of their own stupidity. And when they are young, especially the lambs, when they are young, they have no sense of direction. They wander off looking for greener pastures. And when they do, often a lamb will get away from the flock. And of course, when he does, he becomes prey to wolves, lions, bears, whatever wildlife is out there. Well, when they see a lamb beginning to wander off, the shepherd will take that lamb and break its hind legs. And then he will set them. And then he takes that lamb and makes a sling and carries that lamb in that sling close to his chest, where that lamb is constantly hearing his heartbeat while his legs are healing. Then, once his legs are healed and the shepherd puts him back on the ground, the lamb will never leave the shepherd again. It's a picture. And God is about to break the legs of his lamb, Israel, because they are wandering to other gods, which Paul lets us know in 1 Corinthians 10 that the spirit of an idol is a demon. So it is the evil spirit that is leading them away. So what is he going to do? He's going to keep them out of the briars and the brambles, and he's going to make them lean on him completely. And how does he do that? He breaks their legs, and then he keeps them close. So he's telling them, when you go into Babylon as captives, which is not going to happen for about 200 years yet, when you go in, he's going to be there as the shepherd to comfort them. Now, isn't that a beautiful passage? Now, they probably didn't completely understand it because it hadn't happened yet. We have the benefit of looking back instead of looking forward. In verse 18, he says, he starts talking to them about their idols. And he says, whom will you liken God? And what he's saying is, who can you compare God with? In the next line. But look at an idol. You have a craftsman. So when Christ came, he fulfilled the law of God. Now, the first 5 books of the Old Testament are called the Torah. This is the law of God. And the reason that it is still viable is because this was given to the nation Israel to take to the world. Israel was the only nation that was given God's law. You can read about this in Exodus and in Deuteronomy. And Exodus is where Moses got the law. Deuteronomy is where he explains it. And this law was to teach us to live in prosperity and harmony. In prosperity, in spiritual richness, not just in wealth, but in harmony, we have the wealth of others. It is an easy law to follow, because once you follow that law, then you have good relationships. Galatians says it best: love, peace, joy, long-suffering, self-control. These are the fruit of the Spirit. These are the fruits of obedience to the Spirit of God. Now, we do not live under the law now, which means our salvation does not come from the law. It never did. The law was given to reveal to us the need for salvation. And this is what Isaiah is talking about. I have comfort for you, and that comfort will bring you through your upcoming trial. And that comfort is the promise, the hope of Jesus Christ, the Messiah, and the eternal kingdom of God, also known as Zion. Then in verse 27, he says, "Why do you say, O Jacob, and assert, O Israel, my way is hidden from the Lord, and the justice due me escapes the notice of my God?" Now, here, when he uses the term, Jacob refers to Israel. When he refers to it, he is talking to the human part of Israel. When he calls it Israel, he's speaking to the spiritual part. And what I mean by that, when he says, "Oh, Jacob," this is the rebellious human nature of his nation. God, the nation Israel is God's inheritance. It belongs to God. Always has, always will. So when he is speaking of Israel, he is speaking to Jacob, the human rebellion, and when he's speaking to Israel, he's speaking to the spiritual child. So this is why he will use both phrases. And then he says, "My way is hidden from the Lord, and the justice due me escape the notice of my God. Do you not know? Have you not heard?" Now listen, what they're saying here is, well, I'm going to go worship these idols because God won't see me. And that's simplistic, but that's basically what the heart was saying. Do you not know? Verse 28, have you not heard? Asking the questions. The everlasting God, the Lord, the creator of the ends of the earth, does not become weary or tired. His understanding is inscrutable. He never sleeps. He's always watching. And like a parent watches over a child, God is always watching over his nation, Israel. Remember, this is God's inheritance. That means Israel is the people of Israel are his children. The nation Israel is used as a symbol of God's wife. And we will see that in the next few chapters. And then it tells, we have this famous verse that's put on many plaques and hung on walls and often misinterpreted. But he says, those who wait on the Lord, they will not grow weary. They will mount up with wings like eagles. They will run and not get tired. They will walk and not become weary. He's talking about living a life for him. And it talks about running first, and then it talks about walking. When you're running and you're in that groove, you stay in that momentum until the end, to the finish line. The running overtakes the body. But when you walk, and you're walking at a normal pace, you get tired and weary on the journey. It's more difficult to walk to the finish line than it is for the fit person to run. So it's not out of order. It's that we're going to start off with a sprint in our belief, in our ministry, in our life. Once we find the joy and the peace of having Christ in our lives and being in him and being his servant, it's going to be a sprint because you're so happy. But then when the attacks from the enemy come, when the world tries to put you down, you begin to slow down to a walk. And it's really hard not to become weary, because the world does not like us. In fact, they hate us as Christians. And Jesus told us this in John 17. the world will hate you because it hated me first. So it gets difficult. It gets difficult to stand up for Christ. We're not standing up for our beliefs. We're standing up for the truth of Christ. And it gets difficult. Now, I would like to, in the next few verses, just take a little bit of it and catch us up a little bit. The next one that we see in chapter 41 is the prophecy of the Babylonians coming. He says, listen, one is coming from the north. And when he says this, he says, listen to me in silence. And what he's saying is, shut up and listen. This is important. When he uses the word listen, he's saying to them, you need to pay attention. And then he talks about, he is the one that is going to arouse the north from the north. Now, Babylon, if you look on a map, Babylon is Iraq, over in that area. If you look at it, it's to the east of Israel. But when they came over, they didn't come straight across. They came up and around and then came down from the north. So that's not a wrong interpretation that the Babylonians are going to come. In verse 4, he says, who has performed and accomplished it, calling forth the generations from the beginning? I, the Lord, am the first, and with the last I am he. He is saying from the very beginning to the very end, it is God's plan. He is doing it all. Then after we see that he is telling them about the Babylonians coming, and this is a lengthy verse, but he tells them when they come, your work is nothing. God is using them to punish his own children because of their obedience to the idols, which is the evil spirits. He is trying to rescue them from those evil spirits that seek to destroy. Even today, this was taking place in 700 BC, but on today's news, you can turn it on any channel, and from October 7th of this year, or last year, we have seen the desire to destroy Israel. And when they say, from the river to the sea, at last we'll be free, what they're saying is they want to completely destroy Israel and all Jews, that they will have no place and no existence. This is the same thing. That's what Babylon was trying to do. And this is why God tells them in here, you are of no account. I am in verse 24. And your work amounts to nothing.